What's the Fed?
The Fed?
FED, Fed? The federal government?
What's the Fed?
What's the Fed? I don't know.
Most Americans don't know. Yet we give the Fed enormous power. The Fed likes that.
Your dollar will be worth just as much tomorrow as it is today.
The dollar has lost 96% of its value.
He's been in charge for a while.
Not everybody likes it. I think it's good.
He said housing prices wouldn't crash.
It's a pretty unlikely possibility. We've never had a decline in house prices on a nationwide basis.
He also said,
We're not printing money.
but they do. Now she's going to be in charge.
It is definitely one of the most important economic decisions that I'll make.
It's probably the second most powerful job in the world. Yet people don't know what it is.
What's the what?
The Fed.
I don't know.
The Fed is a small group of old white people who get to spend trillions of your dollars in secret.
No secret cabal of government officials should have the authority to create money out of thin air.
Are you fed up with the Fed?
It's long overdue. We need to audit the Federal Reserve.
It's past time to audit the Federal Reserve.
We have a much more disruptive business cycle than we ever had before we had the Federal Reserve.
Politicians criticizing the Fed. I never used to hear that. Maybe because few understood the Fed or even economics. But whatever the reason, this new interest is a good thing. And I think it happened mostly because one presidential candidate talked about the Fed. For decades, he was the only politician talking about it, and he, of course, is the author of End the Fed, Ron Paul. So, Dr. Paul, those two Democrats and your son want to audit the Fed. You want to end it. How can you be so sure when so many smart people say we need the Fed for stability?
The mess that we're in now is a consequence of the Fed. The Fed has been getting away too long for their responsibility. First, they create the artificial bubbles, and they get a lot of credit for that. Then the crash comes, the correction comes, and then they claim, well, we'll print money faster and we'll get you out of it, and they get credit for, the bump upward. No secret cabal of bankers or government officials should have the authority to create money out of thin air, because they will. And they will destroy the money. It's been known for a long time, way back to ancient Chinese history. They tried this, and it doesn't work. This is what the Constitution said. Nothing but silver and gold can be legal tender. That was the law that was written. Hayek has suggested maybe the best transition would be just to legalize competition, though the book is written to...
Currency competition.
Right, currency competition where the market, maybe Bitcoin offers competition.
Which is legal as far as so far.
Well, but the government doesn't like it either, so we have to wait and see what they do about it. They'll probably crack down on it.
But when you say attach it to gold, I look at gold prices since 1970, and that's not been a stable currency.
If you want to look for stability of gold and purchasing power, look at it over maybe 500 years, and an ounce of gold has certainly maintained a fairly steady purchasing power.
So this group of men has created $4 trillion. And people seem fine with that.
I just think a lot of grown-up people think it's fine, and if you have a problem, you just print more. If you have a problem with debt, you just spend more. Matter of fact, Keynesian economics teaches this. Any type of slowdown, you're supposed to spend more money. And if people won't do it, the government has to do it. If they don't have the money, they try to borrow it, but there's no money to borrow. They just print it out of thin air.
Austrian economics says this will lead to rampant inflation, and yet we haven't had it yet.
No, we haven't had rampant inflation, but we have a lot more inflation than they'll admit to. We certainly had bad inflation in the 70s. I think we have a lot of inflation now. The whole point of Austrian economics is when you destroy the currency by printing a lot of money, you ruin the middle class, you really punish the poor, and you help the wealthy. The money goes to the wealthy class. And right now, today, the money is in the top 1% or 10%. And it's not because of free markets. It's not because of capitalism. It's because of this distortion in the currency. The rich get richer. And look, the middle class is getting wiped out.
Ron Paul just argued that the Fed inflates bubbles and gets credit for the boom. And then the bust happens, and then they ease money, and they get credit for the recovery.
Look, there is some element of truth, I think, to the view that if central banks do things wrong, they could inflate bubbles. I think it's rather important to emphasize there's absolutely no evidence that there are more bubbles or more intense bubbles under central banks than there are when there weren't central banks.
Do you get nervous about giving a dozen people so much power over so much money?
Yeah, so, sometimes I think we all should. Look, we're Americans. We're the most suspicious of authority people there are on earth. That said, I get over that suspicion when I start looking at countries where they don't make the Fed independent. You tend to see much higher average inflation rates over time.
It just confuses me that we can give a dozen old white people the power to spend $4 trillion.
Yeah, but be a little careful with that. In normal times, what they're doing is deciding whether the interest rate goes up, goes down, or stays the same.
But now they're loaning money and buying all these bonds.
Here they're buying securities. They're not. What I was going to object to a little bit is this saying that they're spending money. When you're in an environment that what we call a zero lower bound environment, where you can't loosen monetary policy because you're already at zero, the Fed is just trying to figure out how do you loosen monetary policy when you face that kind of a thing.
And you don't worry about sudden, horrible inflation? There's all this money sloshing around now. They printed it.
Well, I don't. I worry about many things. I'm an economist, so we just sit around every night worrying. We can barely sleep. But of all the things I worry about, rampant, immediate danger of hyperinflation is definitely not in my top 10. Because if you look, economists know a lot about what leads to high inflation. And it's not just the expansion of the monetary base. That's what I think a lot of the, let's call them the gold bugs, the people afraid of immediate inflation, look at the expansion of money and they say, hey, Milton Friedman taught us that expansion of money equals inflation. And what they're forgetting is that in that formula of economists, what matters is not just the monetary base, it's also the velocity of money. Are banks lending? Is the financial system healthy? On one hand, the Fed is on one side printing money, if you want to think of it as that way. But for every bank that's not lending, whereas in the 2000s they were, that's doing the reverse. That's de-printing money. And all the Fed's doing when it's expanding the monetary base is making up for all of the demonetizing that's going on in the fundamentally broken credit system. As that starts to heal, the Fed will get out of the positions that it's in.
Over the next weeks, we'll hear more about Janet Yellen, the president's nominee for Fed chair. Some people will praise her, others will attack her. I say, I don't much care who the chairman is. Janet Yellen may be scarier than some because she's pushed for more stimulus, but all the candidates share the same belief that they, a dozen people, can manage our economy. What conceit! And our leaders voluntarily give them this unbelievable power. Let's put it in perspective. Our bloated government will spend $3.5 trillion this year. This is a crazy amount of money. It's almost double what we spent when Bill Clinton was president. Yet also this year, quietly, the Fed bought government bonds and bank paper, some of which is junk, and lent money to banks, raising its balance sheet, our balance sheet, to $3.6 trillion, just as much as our whole government spent. And most of what the Fed does, it does secretly. Now, I want to trust them. I want to believe they're brilliant people who know what they're doing and mean well, but no 12 people know enough. Knowledge is dispersed throughout our economy, throughout the world. When central bankers try to manage an economy, they usually make things worse. In the 70s, the Fed wrecked lives by enabling double-digit inflation. The new movie about the Fed explained how the Fed governors felt pressured.
They would tell each other, we're not going to let the inflation get out of hand this time. And then the unemployment rate would rise and all that would be forgotten. The whole climate of opinion was against them.
Eventually, Paul Volcker got them to tighten money and inflation did subside. But years later, after the dot-com bubble burst, they brought easy money back again.
The Fed had softened the dot-com crash with aggressive interest rate cuts. And now those same cuts set off another boom.
We actually found that it was kind of interesting and stimulating to put it into houses,
which created an unsustainable bubble in housing.
So we ended up encouraging a housing boom. We, being the Federal Reserve, ended up encouraging a housing boom.
Ben Bernanke, a professor who had just been hired by the Fed, said, we're not going to let prices fall. We are going to create enough dollar bills to lift the prices of everything by a little.
We didn't want to see people out of jobs. Well-intentioned. But the consequences are we created the incentives to borrow.
The housing bubble led to the housing bust.
14 million people took a mortgage in the last 3 years. 7 million of them will lose their homes. This is crazy.
This was textbook. When you take rates that low, you're going to have a boom and a bust is likely to follow.
And I don't think any of us who've ever worked at the Fed take any comfort from the fact that somebody screwed up. Everybody wants to go back and say, things are fine now. Look, we solved our problem. We're just asking for another crisis.
This is an experiment. We've never done this before. We've never been here before. The Federal Reserve is really operating by the seat of their pants.
And we're supposed to trust these people. And most recently, the Fed printed $1 trillion to prop up failing banks, some in foreign countries. More money than the TARP bailouts, which Congress at least voted on. And the Fed money was secret. The trillion only became public because of a Freedom of Information request. We looked for people to defend the Fed on this show. Austan Goolsbee did step up, but it was harder to find someone than I thought it would be. Not long ago, it was only libertarians like Ron Paul who criticized the Fed.
There is no authority in the Constitution authorizing a central bank, which means there should be no Federal Reserve System.
Yeah, well, there is. And today they spend trillions of our dollars, often in secret, and people have no clue about it.
What's the Fed? I don't know.
What's the what?
The Fed.
I don't know.
At least a few people pay attention.
It's a central bank that...
What's it do?
Determines monetary policy and...
What's monetary policy?
How much money to be allowed into circulation.
3 cheers for that guy. And let's hope more people start paying attention. We're talking about trillions of your dollars here.